The receipt prints, the card beeps approved, and my mother-in-law smiles at the woman replacing me. White retail light flattens everything even time, and I stand there in the cosmetics aisle pretending to compare shades while the counter 10 feet away becomes a stage. I didn't agree to enter the credit card, sliding from Elaine Moore's manicured fingers into the cashier's hand with a practiced flick that says, "She belongs here," that money opens doors, that family excuses anything, and the beep lands sharp and clean at 3:42 p.m., loud enough to cut through the store music and the low talk of strangers who don't know my life but will in seconds witness its rearrangement. Daniel Moore, my husband, stands angled toward a rack of scarves like he's browsing, like he's not choosing an exit route, and the woman beside Elaine, Lena Younger glossy, wearing the kind of coat bought to be seen, laughs softly as if approval is applause meant for her, and I feel the old instinct to step forward die, because stepping forward would blur the edges I need to see, would turn this into noise instead of proof, and the object doing the work is simple and cruel. The card, familiar weight, familiar edge, the same plastic I've held at grocery counters and airport kiosks, now paying for a performance I didn't audition for. "Would you like the receipt?" the cashier asks, voice neutral, eyes flicking between Elaine and Lena, and Elaine answers before anyone else can. "Printed, please," with a smile that performs innocence while it sharpens the blade, and Daniel murmurs, "Let's keep it moving," like he's directing traffic, not a marriage, and I hear myself think in verbs instead of feelings. Observe, wait, contain, because panic is loud and I need quiet. "Blue bag or white?" the cashier asks, and Lena says, "White," like choices are hers now, and Elaine adds, "Put the points on my account," and the word account lands wrong, lands owned lands, like she's daring me to contradict her in front of witnesses, and I don't, because witnesses matter, and my phone presses cold against my palm, as if reminding me it exists, as if the banking app is a door I'm choosing not to open yet. "You're good," Daniel tells the cashier, smiling the smile he uses in meetings, and I hear the needle line in his tone even before the words arrive. "Say it again. Your title is wife, not manager, not spoken aloud, but implied in the way he doesn't look at me." And when the receipt starts to crawl out, thin paper whispering, Elaine says too brightly, "Family card, it's fine." And the cashier nods, because cashiers nod at authority, and Lena tilts her head and says, "I love when it's seamless, and I think seamless is what happens when no one asks who's allowed." "Ma'am," a floor associate calls from behind me, and I answer without turning. Just looking, because turning would show my face, and my face would tell the story before I'm ready, and the store's cameras blink red, not accusatory, just present, and present is enough. Daniel's phone buzzes. He silences it without checking and says under his breath, "We're late," and Elaine counters 2 minutes because she's never late to enjoy a victory, and the cashier tears the receipt free and slides it across the paper, stopping short of the edge, and I note the alignment because alignment matters, because patterns reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. "Thank you," Lena says, and the word "thanks" scrapes me, because gratitude implies permission, and permission implies someone granted it, and I know who that someone is, even if the room doesn't. I don't move when the beep echoes again, because stillness keeps the clock honest and the stage bright. "Anything else today?" the cashier asks, and Elaine answers, "No, we're set," as if she's closing a file, and Daniel adds, "Appreciate it," and I finally turn my head just enough to catch my reflection in the glass display, my mouth a straight line, my eyes measuring, and I feel the microshock land late but hard, the visible action already happened, the moral violation already approved, the consequence already public, and the wrongness tightens because the wrong person is holding the right badge of comfort, because money speaks with an accent everyone understands. "Ma'am," the associate says, again closer now, and I step aside to let the trio pass. Elaine first, then Lena, then Daniel, and Daniel's shoulder brushes mine like an accident that isn't, and he whispers, "Not here." A command dressed as concern, and I think of clocks and doors, and how doors close on their own when you wait. "Nice store," Lena says, and Elaine replies, "They know us," and the phrase lands as a policy. And I cataloged the sound of it, the smell of the counter cleaner, the hum of the lights, the exact minutes still burning in my head, because pressure needs a number, and I watched them walk toward the exit, white bag swinging receipt-folded card back in Elaine's wallet, like a flag returned to its case, and I understand something clean and cold. If I speak now, I lose the light. If I wait, the light does the speaking, and the decision settles without drama, a professional choice made in a public room, because the trap only works if the door stays open long enough for everyone to see who walks through it. I let them leave together, knowing the card will stop working when the room is full. I'm Rachel Moore, 38, a senior accounting manager from Plano, Texas, and I used to believe convenience was a form of trust until it trained me to ignore alarms. Back then, the structure felt reasonable. One household, one main account, authorized users added for ease, the kind of arrangement couples explain with a shrug because life moves fast and groceries don't wait. The phone banking app was the object I touched most, its glass cool against my thumb late at night when numbers felt calmer than voices, when reconciling balances was easier than reconciling intentions. And I remembered the first time Daniel asked, "Can we add my mom like it was a scheduling request, not a policy change?" "She runs errands," he said. "It helps." And Elaine followed with, "I don't want to bother you," which was the bother because she always did. I told myself authorization wasn't ownership, that approvals were mechanical, and the app made that belief feel official with green checkmarks and neat lists. The motif appeared without announcing itself, a thin thread. I tugged once and let go. The approval time didn't match where they said they were. I noticed it on a quiet Tuesday, a purchase ping at 8:17 p.m. when Daniel texted "parking now," and I thought traffic bends, clocks, people forget. Minutes don't make cases out of moments. "You worry too much," he told me when I asked, smiling into the fridge light, and Elaine chimed in later. We grabbed something quick as if speed excused place. I had habits that looked like control, but felt like safety. Export statements, color code categories, double-check totals, and the app rewarded me with order, a sense that vigilance equaled virtue. "You're the numbers person," Daniel said once, half praise, half assignment, and I accepted because someone had to be steady. "She's organized," Elaine told a friend on speaker and added, "It's a blessing," which framed my attention as service, not authority. The phone lit my face in bed as I scrolled past ordinary charges, the small thrill of balance intact, the quiet dread of anomaly suppressed, because marriage is a long negotiation with denial. "Can you not do that now?" Daniel asked when the glow woke him, and I said, 2 minutes, because 2 minutes feels harmless, and because he always granted 2 minutes the way he granted indulgences, temporary and revocable. The app logged approvals cleanly, merchant names, generic locations tidy, and I learned to read between the lines the way accountants do, not hunting wrongdoing, just pattern. "Everything okay?" Elaine asked at brunch when I paused mid-sip, and I answered, "Fine, because fine is the word you use when you don't want witnesses yet." She laughed and said, "You look tired," a needle line disguised as concern, and Daniel added, "She works too hard, turning my vigilance into a flaw." There were other tells, Elaine's habit of turning her phone face down, Daniel's new silence when pings sounded, the way receipts stopped appearing in the kitchen drawer. But behavioral cues aren't evidence, they're weather, and weather passes if you wait. "You don't trust me," Daniel asked once, sharp and fast, and I said I trust math, which earned a scoff. "Don't be dramatic," Elaine said, later touching my arm like a bookmark, and I pulled away under the table, counting breaths because counting steadies. The app showed authorized users, neatly my name first because order reflects responsibility, and I didn't tell myself what that meant yet. "It's just plastic," Daniel said during a drive, radio low, and I replied, "It's access," and he laughed like access was a joke. I watched approval notifications land during meetings, my phone buzzing in my purse like a conscience, and I trained myself not to check until after because I didn't want to be the person who interrupts rooms with suspicion. "You're always on that thing," Daniel complained, and I said, "It's work because sometimes the truth needs a costume." I remembered Elaine's words at a party family card. It's fine, and how she said family like a clause, not a feeling, and I wondered when clauses started outranking consent. The phone app recorded time of day faithfully impartial, a witness that didn't care who smiled, and I told myself that witnesses become useful only when you invite them. "Why are you so quiet?" Daniel asked one night, and I said, "Listening, because listening buys time." I kept my posture calm, my questions small, my exports private, understanding that escalation without leverage is noise. The pattern didn't accuse anyone, but it refused to disappear once I noticed it. Elaine's voice carried through calls, warm and declarative. "We're all adults," she'd say, and Daniel would echo, "It's nothing," and I would nod because nodding keeps doors open. The app asked for confirmation when settings changed, a small alert. I dismissed once too quickly, and later I scolded myself for speed, for trusting momentum over permission. "You okay?" Daniel asked, as I closed the app, and I answered, "Just tired because tiredness is believable." I slept lightly, counting transactions like sheep, waking to the hum of the house, and the sense that time itself was misfiled, that approvals were happening in the margins. "You don't have to micromanage," Elaine said on a call, her voice sugar smooth, and I replied, "I don't," which was true. If you define management as interference, I wasn't interfering yet. I was preparing. The app's history stretched back in tidy rows, and I learned to scroll without reacting, to collect without accusing, to let the record speak later when the room was bright enough to hear it. "Trust is simple," Daniel said. "Once irritated, you either have it or you don't." And I thought about how accounting teaches the opposite, that trust is a process with controls, not a feeling you abandon safeguards for. I didn't cancel anything, then didn't confront, didn't warn, because warnings teach people how to hide, and hiding changes timestamps. The phone went dark as I set it face down, choosing sleep over certainty for one more night, knowing certainty would arrive on its own schedule if I stayed still. I let the app keep counting because timing matters more than anger. I waited until the store thinned before I moved, because crowds blur faces, and I needed faces to remember me later, and the printed receipt became the object that mattered, a thin, white ribbon left half-folded on the counter when Elaine turned to adjust the white bag on her arm, and Daniel angled his body to block sight lines like a habit learned young. The cashier slid it closer with a practiced motion, eyes already moving to the next customer, and I stepped in as if I belonged there, the way confidence borrows uniforms. My phone lifted not to steal, but to record what was already public, and the cost arrived immediately, when Daniel's head snapped toward me, his smile stalling mid-curve. "You done?" he asked too loud, and the cashier glanced up and I said, "Just checking something, which is the truth accountants use to buy seconds." The receipt showed the merchant line and the location tag store name North Wing, and a time of day stamp burned clean at 3:42 p.m., a small detail that mattered because Daniel had texted me 10 minutes earlier. Still at the office, and Elaine had said on speaker, "We're just grabbing coffee, which doesn't live in a cosmetics aisle." My thumb hovered, and the camera click felt indecently loud, and the cashier's eyes narrowed just enough to register curiosity. And Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice into that corporate calm he uses to manage rooms. "Put it away," he said, a needle line sharpened with familiarity. "Read the policy. Customers can't photograph receipts." And I smiled and answered, "I am the customer, because words create lanes and lanes keep order." Elaine's perfume drifted between us, floral and declarative, and she said, "Is there a problem?" like she owned the answer, and I shook my head. "No, because the problem wasn't hers to solve yet." Lena stood a half step back, studying a lipstick display she wasn't touching, eyes flicking to my phone, then away, a stolen glance that told me she knew the rules had shifted. "We're late," Daniel said again, and I nodded. "So am I," which confused him long enough for me to get the frame receipt centered. Merchant line, crisp time stamp, legible store location, visible evidence earned with a social bruise that would color future interactions. The cashier cleared her throat. "Ma'am, please," and I lowered the phone, apology ready. Of course, and the apology was a tool, not a surrender. Elaine waved it off. "She's fine," she told the cashier, reclaiming authority, then turned to me. "You always worry a soft insult that framed vigilance as pathology." And Daniel added, "Don't start. which was a command dressed as marital concern, and I filed it under pattern. I stepped aside and let them pass because confrontation spends capital. I needed to save, and I followed at a distance enough to keep sightlines, but not enough to trigger a scene, watching the white bag swing, watching Elaine tuck the receipt into her wallet, like a keepsake watching Daniel scan exits the way sales directors scan objections. At the end of the aisle, Lena paused and said quietly to Elaine, "Should we?" And Elaine cut her off with a smile. "It's handled," and the word handled landed like a ledger closed prematurely. My phone buzzed a notification from the banking app I ignored on purpose, because timing matters, because evidence gains weight when it sits long enough to gather context. "You don't need to do this," Daniel said as we reached the atrium, lowering his voice again. "Say it again. Your role is wife, not auditor." The needle line finally spoken with a thin laugh that expected compliance, and I answered evenly, "Then stop filing returns in public." And he blinked, surprised by the specificity. The store's atrium light was brighter, unforgiving, and I felt the microshock ripple outward, not mine theirs, as they realized the record existed outside their smiles. A security guard walked past, radio murmuring, and Elaine's posture straightened. "Performance recalibrated, family errand," she said to no one. And I said nothing because silence is an audit tool. I slipped into a seating area and reviewed the image, zooming to confirm the safe field's time of day clear store location intact, checking for glare, for blur, for any excuse they could use later, and the cost of being seen lingered as a weight. The cashier's look. Daniel's anger, Elaine's condescension, all of it, a tax paid up front to avoid interest later. My phone chimed again, and this time I checked not for approval, but for corroboration, scrolling back to the text thread where Daniel had claimed the office, noting the timestamp mismatch without annotating it yet, because annotation is interpretation, and interpretation invites argument. "You okay?" Lena asked Daniel within earshot, a line meant to appear caring, and he replied, "She's fine," pointing at me without looking, a possessive gesture that confirmed the dynamic better than any confession. I stood and walked past them toward the exit, not running, not lingering, and Elaine called after me. "Dinner Sunday," a social leash tossed casually, and I said, "We'll see, because maybe is a boundary when no is too loud." Outside, the air cooled my face, and I let my shoulders drop, for the first time, reviewing the evidence again, understanding how small details shift power when assembled carefully, understanding that this was only the first fracture, and that fractures widen under pressure if you don't rush to fill them with excuses. I texted Daniel once, "We'll talk later," neutral procedural, and he replied immediately, "Don't make a scene," which I saved because prevention implies expectation. The receipt didn't accuse anyone, but it refused to agree with their story once the time was visible. I drove home and backed up the image, naming the file with a short code and the location, because order prevents accidents, and I replayed the moment Daniel tried to block my camera, the way Elaine reclaimed authority, the way Lena watched the floor, and I understood that the first evidence had already altered behavior, had tightened voices, had introduced fear into a space where confidence used to live. I didn't cancel anything, didn't confront, didn't warn, because warnings teach people to clean their tracks, and clean tracks make messy truths harder to prove. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the counter and poured water, listening to the house settle, feeling the pressure of what I now held, a thin white slip, turned into leverage by patience and light, and I knew the next move would require witnesses, because private records are powerful, but public rooms decide outcomes. I let the image sit, because the clock only becomes evidence when you stop interrupting it. The next afternoon, I returned to the store with intention instead of shock, because public rooms respond to preparation the way private ones never do, and the object that mattered this time wasn't the card or the receipt, but the store's CCTV monitor mounted behind customer service like an unblinking eye that nobody notices until they need it. The atrium smelled the same, the light was just as white, and the clock above the directory read 2:11 p.m. early enough that managers were still patient and late enough that shoppers had opinions. And I positioned myself at the return counter with a box I didn't intend to open because returns buy you conversations and conversations open screens. "Hi," I said to the associate voice, "even I need help with a transaction," and she nodded with practiced neutrality. Receipt and I replied, "I have the time," which earned a blink and a pause. Daniel had texted that morning, "We're all good, right?" And I hadn't answered because unanswered messages create room. Elaine had called once, then twice, leaving a voicemail that said, "We don't do drama," which is what people say when they're planning to accuse you of starting some. The associate leaned closer. "What seems to be the issue," and I lowered my voice just enough to make it feel procedural. "Yesterday at 3:42 p.m., there was a charge at this counter," and I pointed. "I need to verify it," and she glanced back at the monitor, hesitation creasing her forehead. "I can get a supervisor," she said, and I nodded. "Please, because supervision makes things official." While we waited, a woman behind me sighed audibly. This line and another said, "Returns are always a mess." And the murmurs mattered because witnesses are currency. A security guard drifted closer, radio hissing softly, and I noted his badge color and stance cataloging details, because details anchor truth later. The supervisor arrived, a man with a lanyard and a tired smile, and said, "How can I help?" And I repeated the request slower. "I need to confirm a transaction from 3:42 p.m. North Wing Cosmetics." And he looked to the monitor instinctively. Muscle memory betraying policy. "We don't usually," he began, and I interrupted gently. "I understand limitations because acknowledging limits invites exceptions. I'm not asking for footage to leave the store," and he exhaled the word leave, doing work for me. "Let me see," he said, and the associate tapped keys, and the screen flickered from blue to grayscale, the counter appearing from an overhead angle that flattened faces and sharpened movement. A shopper near me leaned forward unconsciously, curiosity spreading like static. "That's the counter," the supervisor said, and I nodded. "At 3:42 p.m., and he scrubbed the timeline, the seconds ticking backward, and there it was. Elaine's posture, unmistakable. The card extended. Daniel angled away, Lena's white coat catching the light, the cashier's hands moving with the rhythm of approval. Is that the associate began and stopped, and I felt the room's temperature change because seeing is different from hearing. "We can't identify customers," the supervisor said. "Careful," and I answered, "I'm not asking you to because identification wasn't the point. Confirmation was." The guard shifted his weight. Another shopper whispered, "Oh, wow," and the supervisor cleared his throat. "What exactly are you disputing?" And I kept my tone factual, the authorization because authority lives in verbs. "Do you have a receipt?" he asked, and I said, "I have the time and the location, and the monitor did the rest," the timestamp in the corner crisp enough to read from a distance. "We don't usually show this," he said again, and I replied, "I know," which disarmed him more than arguing would have. The associate glanced at the line forming and asked, "Should I pause returns?" And the supervisor nodded, and the line paused with it attention condensing. A woman to my left said, "Is this about fraud?" too loudly, and I didn't answer because silence lets other people supply the word. "It's about verification," the supervisor said, choosing safety, and I appreciated the precision. Daniel called then, my phone buzzing against the counter, his name lighting the screen like a warning label, and the supervisor noticed, "You want to take that?" And I shook my head. "No, because refusing a call in public communicates resolve without accusation." "We're seeing the transaction," the supervisor said finally, "at 3:42 p.m., and I nodded. "That's correct," and he added. "It was approved," and I said, "Approval doesn't equal permission." Not loud, not soft, just placed, and a few heads turned at the clarity of it. The screen froze on the moment the card changed hands, and the room decided it mattered. The supervisor looked at me, then at the guard, then back at the screen triangulating responsibility and said, "We can log this," and the word log landed like a gavel. "Please do," I replied, and he asked for my name, and I gave it because names belong in logs, and the associate typed fingers, quick eyes avoiding mine out of politeness or fear. "Do you want a copy?" the supervisor asked, meaning a printout, and I shook my head. I just need confirmation. It occurred here at that time, and he nodded. Confirmed and wrote it down the pen, scratching audible in the quiet. A shopper behind me said, "That's messed up, not quietly enough." And another replied, "Families with a shake of the head," and the social verdict assembled itself without my help. Daniel's phone buzzed again, then stopped, then buzzed with a text preview. "This is unnecessary," and I ignored it because necessity is defined by outcomes, not comfort. Elaine arrived then, timing impeccable as always, breezing into the atrium with her practiced smile. "There you are," she said, touching my arm as if we were co-conspirators. We had lunch, and the supervisor looked from her to the screen and back, confusion flickering. "Is there a problem?" Elaine asked him. Tone warm, and he answered carefully. "We're assisting a customer," and she laughed lightly. "Oh, that's fine," and turned to me. "You worry too much the needle line delivered in public now," and I stepped half a pace back so her hand fell away. "Please don't," I said, and the guard's gaze sharpened. "Ma'am?" the supervisor said firmer now. "We need to keep this area clear," and Elaine bristled, authority challenged. "I know the manager," she said, and he replied, "I am the manager on duty," a clean correction that drew a murmur from the paused line. Daniel appeared at the edge of the crowd, jaw tight, eyes calculating, and said, "Can we take this outside?" And the supervisor answered before I could. "Not while we're documenting," and Daniel's control slipped a fraction enough for people to notice. "This is ridiculous," Elaine said, and I replied, "It's recorded," which is a sentence that closes arguments. The supervisor finished the log and looked at me. "Is there anything else?" And I said, "No, because less is more when the room is watching." He turned the monitor back to blue, but the image lingered in the air, replicated in whispers and glances, and the guard stepped forward, gentle but present. "Let's keep moving." And the line resumed with a hum that felt like judgment. As we separated, Daniel hissed, "You're embarrassing us," and I answered quietly. "You did that at 3:42 p.m., and the precision stung him more than anger would have." Outside, the light softened, and I breathed understanding that the second evidence had done its job, not by shouting, but by existing in a place where denial had witnesses. I didn't collect paper, didn't demand copies, didn't escalate beyond the room because escalation is a ladder you climb when you can see the top. I walked away knowing the camera had already testified, and the next step would bring authority closer. I didn't tell Daniel or Elaine what I was doing next, because explanation creates friction, and friction teaches people where to sand, so I worked in quiet rooms where paper behaves and printers don't gossip. The object of the day, a transaction log printout that felt heavier than its weight once it landed in my hands. Pages warm from the machine margins, clean columns aligned, and the house silent enough that the tick of the wall clock sounded like a metronome setting my pace. The banking portal loaded without ceremony, and I exported the account activity by category and by time window. Not because I needed more proof, but because patterns need context to speak clearly, and the log delivered what the receipt and camera had hinted at: masked last 4 digits, consistent across charges, merchant clusters forming around specific days, approvals landing in the same hour bands like habits, not errands. I marked 3:42 p.m. in pencil, not pen, because flexibility matters until it doesn't, and I traced backward to see the drift begin weeks earlier, a slow normalization of spending that lived just below the threshold of attention Daniel knew I'd flag. You always find something, he used to joke, and I realized the joke had trained him to discount discovery as temperament rather than signal. I spread the pages across the dining table and stood, not sitting, because standing keeps your spine honest, and I read the log aloud under my breath, letting the cadence of numbers strip emotion from the exercise, letting the evidence alter my behavior in small, disciplined ways. No calls, no texts, no confrontations, because every reaction leaves residue. Someone can analyze later. The cost of this evidence was time and isolation. While I worked, Daniel moved through the house with a deliberate loudness, cabinets closed harder than necessary, his phone calls migrating to the garage, and Elaine's voice arrived via voicemail. "We should clear the air," she said. air being her word for pressure, and I archived the message without replying, because archives are for retrieval, not response. The log showed a cadence that aligned with Daniel's travel calendar and Elaine's social schedule, a triangulation I hadn't planned but welcomed, and I noted the masked last four, again confirming continuity without exposing full numbers, the safe fields doing their quiet work. I remembered the supervisor's pen scratching at the store and how the word log had landed there too, and I smiled briefly at the symmetry because systems rhyme when they're honest. "Are you printing our finances?" Daniel asked from the doorway, irritation sharpened by the sight of paper, and I answered evenly, "I'm reviewing activity," which was accurate enough to deny him leverage. "This is invasive," he said, a needle line dressed as ethics, and I replied, "Read the clause out loud. The room should hear it, quoting policy without naming it," and he scoffed. "You're being dramatic, because drama is the accusation people use when facts arrive without permission." I turned a page and saw a sequence that broke the last illusion. I'd been protecting purchases clustered on days Daniel had sworn he was elsewhere, approvals landing within minutes of texts that placed him across town, the log refusing to reconcile with their story no matter how gently I asked it to. The numbers didn't argue back, and that silence made their voices louder by contrast. I underlined the sequence lightly and wrote a short code in the margin to anchor it later, a habit from audits that keeps stories straight, and I felt the internal break happen not as grief, but as recalibration, the moment you stop hoping an explanation will arrive and start planning for what to do when it doesn't. The house phone rang Elaine this time, and I let it ring until the machine answered her message, brisk and cheerful. "We're family. We don't keep score," which I laughed at quietly, because scorekeeping is exactly what families do when money blurs boundaries. Daniel hovered near the table, eyes scanning the pages like a pilot looking for a storm he pretends not to see, and said, "You don't have to do this." And I answered I already did because completion closes debates. I stacked the pages and clipped them together, a small act that made the evidence feel official, and slid the packet into a folder I didn't label, because labels attract curiosity. The log had already altered my posture, my voice, my schedule, and that was the rule I respected most. Evidence should change how you move before it changes anyone else's. I washed my hands, feeling the grit of toner on my fingers, and the domestic normalcy of it steadied me because justice is easier to pursue when you keep routines intact. Daniel followed me to the sink, lowered his voice. "What do you want?" And I turned off the faucet and met his eyes. Accuracy, a word that unsettles people who trade in narratives. He laughed without humor. "You think a spreadsheet proves anything?" And I answered, "It proves consistency." And his jaw tightened because consistency is hard to dismiss. I spent the afternoon scanning the pages into a secure folder and then returned the originals to the drawer, not destroying anything, not flaunting, just placing the weight where it belonged. And I sent one email to myself with a subject line that looked boring enough to be ignored, attaching the file and nothing else because the absence of commentary keeps records clean. The log's logic fracture deepened as I cross-checked times with the store visit and the text thread, not to build a case yet, but to understand the shape of it, where pressure would need to be applied and where silence would do more work. Elaine texted later, "We should talk," and I replied, "Later," which satisfied protocol without surrendering ground. Daniel tried once more. "You're going to regret this," and I said, "Regret is cheaper than ignorance." And he shook his head like I'd broken a rule we'd never agreed to. As evening settled, I sat at the table again and looked at the clipped pages, feeling the strange calm that arrives when doubt is replaced by direction, and I understood that this evidence would demand the next step, not emotionally but procedurally, because logs don't beg, they point. I didn't sleep much that night, but when I did, it was without the old static, the house quiet except for the hum of appliances and the steady sense that the ledger was now balanced enough to move. I closed the drawer, knowing the log had ended the argument, and the next move would shift power. I met Mark Feldman in his office at 9:06 a.m. early enough that the building still smelled like cleaning solution and coffee instead of confidence. And the sealed legal envelope sat between us like a neutral third party waiting to be invited into the conversation. Heavy stock, clean edges, the kind of object that changes posture the moment it appears. Mark didn't rush, which I appreciated, and he read without commentary while I watched the clock tick and listened to the hum of HVAC, because silence is a test. People fail when they're bluffing, and I wasn't bluffing. Primary account holder, he said finally, tapping the page with a pen. Sole authority to modify, suspend, or terminate, and the words felt less like victory than alignment because authority is calmer when it's documented. I nodded and slid him the transaction log summary I'd prepared, not the whole stack, just enough to show pattern without dramatics, and he scanned the time bands, the masked last four, the merchant clustering, then looked up. "You understand the difference between cancellation and freeze," he said, and I answered, "Yes, because precision matters, and because freezing creates a window that people misinterpret as mercy." Mark folded the letter he'd drafted and slipped it into the envelope, sealing it with a practiced press of his thumb, and the sound of paper meeting adhesive felt like a switch being thrown somewhere quiet and irreversible. "We'll send this after confirmation," he said, and I asked confirmation from whom, and he smiled thinly. "From them indirectly, which is how law borrows truth from behavior." On my phone, a notification buzzed Daniel again, and I turned the screen face down without checking, because this room required clean lines, not noise. Mark noticed and said, "You're ready," not as encouragement, but as assessment. The motif returned with weight, now the echo of those approvals ringing against the language of authority, every beep leaving a timestamp scar you can't scrub out once it's logged. And I felt the pressure shift from my chest to the room itself, distributed across paper and policy where it belonged. "We need one more thing," Mark added, "proof of control," and I slid him the portal screenshot, showing user roles, the hierarchy laid bare without commentary, and he nodded. "That'll do, because law doesn't need feelings, it needs lanes." When he sealed the envelope, the approvals that once sounded harmless finally learned to keep time. I left his office with the envelope in my bag and a plan in my calendar, the day segmented into tasks that felt almost boring, and boredom is how you know you're doing it right. On the drive home, I called Tina Alvarez, the mall's security supervisor, whose card I'd received during the earlier visit when eyes met, and professionalism recognized itself, and I said, "I need a favor that stays inside policy," and she replied, "Say more, because policy loves specificity. I need confirmation of camera retention windows," I said, and she answered without hesitation. 30 days for retail counters, 90 for Atrium. And I noted the dates mentally, aligning them with my schedule, because clocks are characters in this story, whether anyone admits it or not. "I may need you present," I added, and she paused, then said, "If it's logged, I can stand there," and the word "stand" mattered because presence is leverage in public rooms. Back at the house, Daniel paced, his voice tight. "We need to talk," and I replied, "Later, not to punish, but to protect sequence." Elaine texted, "You're taking this too far," which I archived next to her earlier voicemail, creating a neat chain of escalation she didn't realize she was building for me. I placed the envelope in a drawer I don't use often, not hiding it so much as removing it from daily sight, because tools work best when you don't fidget with them. The afternoon passed in emails and meetings where I sounded normal enough to be believed later, and normalcy is a shield. At 4:18 p.m., Mark emailed a single line, "Ready when you are," and I replied, "Tomorrow, because timing converts documents into outcomes." That night, Daniel tried a different approach, softer. "We can fix this," and I asked, "What is this forcing definition?" And he said, "Misunderstandings," and I shook my head. "Read the clause out loud." The needle line delivered quietly, "Authority isn't a misunderstanding." And he went silent, which told me he knew the room had changed, even if he didn't know how. I slept better than I had in weeks, the envelope's weight not on my chest but in a drawer contained, and in the morning I dressed plainly and packed lightly because public scenes punish theatrics. At 10:02 a.m., I met Tina at the mall's service corridor, the fluorescent light honest and unflattering, and she confirmed the process again, log monitor supervisor present, her professionalism a steady rail I could lean on. "You want me visible?" she asked, and I said yes, because visibility turns procedure into proof. My phone buzzed with the group text Daniel and Elaine together now. "We're coming by," and I didn't reply because arrivals are more useful when you don't schedule them. The sealed envelope stayed in my bag, a quiet promise I didn't intend to cash yet, and as we walked toward the customer service area, the monitor flickered to life blue, waiting to become grayscale, and the atrium filled with the mid-morning crowd, parents and retirees and shoppers with opinions ready. Tina took her place near the counter, neutral present, and the associate looked to her and then to me, understanding, without explanation. Daniel appeared first, jaw set, Elaine a step behind, smile ready. Lena absent this time, and that absence mattered because it narrowed their audience to people who didn't owe them loyalty. "This is unnecessary," Daniel said, and Tina replied evenly, "Sir, please step back," and the authority in her voice carried farther than his irritation. I asked for the supervisor, and he came, and the monitor woke, and the familiar frame returned timestamp clear. The moment replayed not as accusation, but as record. Elaine laughed too quickly. Again, and I answered, "Yes, because repetition is how truth hardens." Tina noted the time on her clipboard, a small action that made the crowd lean in, and Daniel's phone buzzed as if on cue, and he silenced it without looking, a reflex that now read as guilt in this room. I didn't open the envelope yet. I let the scene breathe, let the camera do its work, let the witnesses absorb the pattern without commentary, because pressure needs space to build. The room brightened as policy and proof aligned, and the clock stopped forgiving anyone. When the supervisor finished the entry and nodded to Tina, I knew the window had opened wide enough to step through later. Not now, and I thanked them both and walked away with the envelope still sealed, because restraint is the last ingredient people underestimate. Outside, the air felt sharper, and my phone chimed with Mark's number. I didn't answer, not yet, because the echo needed to carry into the next act, where authority would enter on time, not early. I drove home and placed the envelope back in its drawer, the seal intact. Understanding that power isn't the act of canceling, but the certainty that you can, and that certainty had already changed how everyone around me moved. I left the envelope unopened, knowing the next approval beep would be the last one they heard. I started recording at 6:58 p.m. without announcing it, because announcements change voices, and I needed Daniel's unguarded one, the audio recorder small and ordinary on the kitchen counter between a bowl of keys and the mail, its red dot steady patient, an object that doesn't argue. The house smelled like reheated food and citrus cleaner, domestic enough to lull people into thinking rules are relaxed here, and Daniel leaned against the island with the posture he uses when he's about to sell a compromise. "We don't need lawyers," he said. Palms open, a smile rehearsed for persuasion, and I replied, "Then tell me the truth, because truth is cheaper than strategy when it's available." He exhaled, looked at the window instead of me, and said, "You're blowing one thing out of proportion, a phrase that reduces facts to feelings," and I waited because silence stretches sentences until they reveal their seams. Elaine arrived late, heels clicking a warning across tile, and said brightly, "I brought dessert," setting a box down like a peace offering, then noticing the recorder. "What's that?" And I answered, "A record, which is the most neutral word for accountability." She laughed once, sharp. "You're recording us." And I nodded. "Yes, because permission is implied when you continue speaking," and she glanced at Daniel for alignment before choosing her tone. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice rising just enough to recruit the room. "We're family," and I replied. "Read the clause out loud, the room should hear it," repeating the needle line until it stopped sounding theatrical and started sounding inevitable. Daniel stepped in. "Turn it off," he said, a command he expected compliance to follow, and I shook my head. "Keep talking," and he did, because people who believe they're right rarely stop. "My mom uses the card for errands," he said, precise. "Now, careful. Sometimes with friends." And Elaine added, "I never hid anything," her hand flattening the dessert box like a claim, and I asked, "At 3:42 p.m. yesterday, where were you?" A simple question that shouldn't frighten anyone. Innocent. Daniel answered too fast. Office then corrected. Parking then laughed. "Why does it matter?" and the recorder caught the shift, the stutter that timestamps love. Elaine waved it away. We were shopping, and I said, "With whom?" And she smiled. "Does it matter?" And I answered, "Yes, because specificity is the opposite of drama." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is harassment," he said, a word chosen to flip the roles, and I responded, "It's documentation." And the recorder hummed approval without sound. Elaine leaned forward. "You don't get to interrogate us." And I said, "I get to verify," and the distinction landed with weight, the kind that changes breathing. "You're making things worse," Daniel said, voice low, and I replied, "Then stop lying." And the word lying cracked the room, not loud, but precise. He laughed again, brittle. What lie? And I played the question back to him. Office or parking, and the pause that followed was long enough to be useful. The recorder captured the silence where a truth should have been, and silence chose sides. Elaine broke it. "This is unfair," she said, eyes bright. "You're trying to trap us," and I answered, "No, I'm letting you talk." And she glanced again at the red dot like it had teeth. Daniel shifted tactics. "Fine," he said. We stopped for coffee, and I asked where, and he shrugged. "Near the mall," and I nodded, at 3:42 p.m., and the shrug turned into irritation. "You're obsessed," he snapped, the needle line now sharpened. "Say it again." "Your role is wife, not detective," and I replied, "My role is account holder, a fact I still hadn't put in writing here, letting it hang like a ceiling light about to flick on. Elaine stood. "I'm leaving," she announced authority, trying to reclaim space. And Tina's name crossed my mind as a counterweight, the memory of her stance by the counter earlier, and I said calmly, "Before you go, answer one thing." And Elaine paused, hand on the door. "What?" And I asked, "Did you tell Lena she could use the card?" And Elaine laughed. "Of course not too quickly." And Daniel said, "Who too slowly?" And the recorder held both answers without judgment. I turned off the recorder then, not because I needed more, but because stopping signals control, and control unnerves people who thought they had it. "This is over," Daniel said, pointing at the device, and I replied, "No, because over is decided later." Elaine gathered her purse. "You're destroying this family," she said, and I answered, "Families don't destroy themselves with receipts," and she flinched at the word. When they left, the house fell quiet, and I saved the file, labeling it with a short code, and the time window adding it to the folder without listening again, because repetition breeds emotion, and I needed distance. The evidence had done its work already. Daniel's texts stopped for hours. Elaine's number went dark, and a different pressure filled the space, the kind that builds when people realize the record exists outside their control. At 9:12 p.m., Mark texted, "Any admissions?" and I replied, "Denials, because denials recorded our admissions later," and he sent back a thumbs-up professional shorthand for proceed. I slept lightly, the recorder charging on the counter like a witness, recharging between sessions. And in the morning, my phone chimed with a voicemail from Elaine. Voice: "Careful now. We should handle this privately," and I archived it next to the others, the escalation ladder filling rung by rung. The next step wasn't confrontation, but presence, the public room where people mind their words, because they know eyes are on them, and I scheduled it without invitations, trusting gravity to bring the right bodies together. At 11:40 a.m., Daniel showed up at my office unannounced, face tight. "You can't do this," he said, and I answered, "Watch me, because certainty speaks softly." He tried one last needle line. "You're humiliating us," and I replied, "You did that when you approved the charge," and he went pale, the word approved finally carrying its full weight. I walked past him with the recorder in my bag, knowing the next room would have witnesses who don't belong to us. The conference room at the mall's management office felt intentionally bland, beige walls, and a long table designed to make people speak carefully, and the projector remote sat under my palm like a quiet detonator. Matte black warm from the lights, an object that turns rooms into witnesses when you press the right button. Tina stood near the door with her clipboard posture neutral, and the supervisor from before hovered by the laptop, ready but cautious, while a few staff members lingered on the edges, pretending to check emails. curiosity leaking through professionalism, and the clock on the wall read 1:27 p.m. a time. I chose because lunch crowds spill opinions without committing to them. Daniel arrived first, jaw tight, suit jacket folded over his arm like a concession, and said, "Why are we here?" And I answered to reconcile timelines, which sounded boring enough to pass policy. Elaine followed with a smile set too high. This again, she laughed, and I said yes, because repetition is how contradictions reveal themselves. The laptop hummed awake, the projector fan whispering, and I pressed the remote once to test the connection, the blue screen bathing faces in a pale honesty that flattens expressions. "We're not doing a presentation," Daniel snapped, and Tina replied evenly, "Sir, please have a seat." Authority arriving without apology. I clicked forward, and the first slide appeared, not a slideshow, just a still frame with two columns, one labeled Approval, the other Presence, plain words chosen to avoid drama, and the room leaned in despite itself. "This is inappropriate," Elaine said, crossing her arms, and I replied, "It's math because math keeps people from arguing about tone." I advanced the slide, the remote clicking softly, and the evidence did its work. A sequence showing approval times clustered at 3:42 p.m., 3:39 p.m., 3:45 p.m., paired against presence markers, pulled from their own statements and logs, parking office coffee, none aligning with the same minutes. The safe fields were visible without shouting. Time of day stamps, crisp location tags, generic but consistent, and the contradiction sat there like a bruise under bright light. "That's not definitive," Daniel said, pointing phone's lag, and I nodded. Sometimes then clicked again to reveal the gap chart, a simple bar showing the mismatch window, and Tina noted the time on her clipboard, a small act that made the room feel official. When the approvals lined up against where they claimed to be the timestamps, refused to blink first. Elaine laughed too loudly. "You're connecting dots that don't exist." And I replied, "Read the numbers out loud," and the supervisor cleared his throat, uncomfortable but present, and said, "The approvals are within minutes of each other, choosing neutrality while stating fact." Daniel leaned forward. "This is harassment," he said again, the word losing power with repetition. And Tina answered, "Sir, this is a documented review, and the word documented carried weight because it had witnesses now." I clicked to the next frame showing the store CCTV timestamp paired with the approval beep time, side by side, the alignment impossible to ignore, and the staffer at the back whispered, "Oh," not loudly enough to be rude, but loud enough to ripple. "You can't use internal footage like this," Elaine protested, and the supervisor said, "We're viewing it on site, a boundary that satisfied policy without saving face." Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked it despite himself, then silenced it, and the action looked like guilt in this room, even if it wasn't. "Explain this," I said, not accusing, just asking for a bridge that could carry weight. And Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "We were nearby, a retreat from certainty," and I clicked again to show the distance estimate. Conservative, unarguable, the numbers refusing to accommodate nearby as a concept. The projector's fan hummed the room warm now with attention, and Elaine tried a new angle. "This is about control," she said, turning to the supervisor. "She's always been controlling," and I replied, "Control is canceling conversations. Verification is checking clocks." And Tina wrote something down, not because she needed to, but because the act itself disciplines speech. The remote clicked again, and the final frame appeared a simple timeline with approvals highlighted, and presence claims shaded the overlap. Empty, the contradiction complete, and the room went quiet in that way that tells you people are recalculating their positions. Daniel pushed back his chair. "We're done," he said, standing, and Tina stepped forward a fraction. "Please remain seated," and he hesitated the fraction enough to register compliance. "This doesn't prove anything," Elaine insisted, voice thinner now, and I said, "It proves inconsistency, which is all evidence ever needs to do at this stage." I turned the projector off. The blue light, fading faces returning to normal color, but not to normal expressions, and I placed the remote on the table deliberately, a signal that the presentation was over and the record remained. The supervisor cleared his throat. "We'll note this," he said, and I nodded. "Please, because notes become doors later." Daniel finally sat, hands clenched. "What do you want?" he asked, and I answered. "Accuracy," the word echoing from earlier. Consistent, boring, powerful. Elaine scoffed weakly. "You're enjoying this," and I shook my head. "No, because enjoyment is loud, and this was quiet, and quiet is how truth stays standing." I gathered my bag and stood, not rushing, not lingering, and Tina opened the door, the hallway beyond, brighter than the room we'd just left, and I felt the shift happen, the second reversal snapping into place as the audience absorbed what denial couldn't erase. Outside, Daniel caught up to me, voice low. "You can't do this publicly," and I answered. I didn't, gesturing back at the room. The room did, and he stopped, understanding, dawning too late to help him. Elaine didn't follow, choosing instead to talk to the supervisor, her posture pleading now, and I walked away because pleading changes stories, and I needed the record unchanged. At 2:03 p.m., Mark's number lit my phone, and I answered this time. "They're inconsistent," I said, and he replied, "Good, because good in this context meant ready." As I drove home, the projector remote's imprint lingered on my palm like a bruise, a reminder that rooms can be taught to remember if you show them where to look. And I knew the next step would close the loop, not with slides but with badges, not with numbers but with authority arriving on time. I put the remote back in my bag, certain the mismatch had finally cornered them where witnesses could see it. The bank notice letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded once too many times, the envelope creased as if it had traveled through several hands before finding mine. And the object did its quiet work the moment I recognized the logo and the weight of official language inside a gravity that pulls conversations into narrower lanes, whether people want it to or not. I didn't open it immediately because anticipation sharpens attention, and I needed attention clean, not rushed, so I set it on the table beside my keys and watched Daniel circle it with his eyes, the way people circle something they hope will disappear if they don't touch it. "What's that?" he asked, trying for casual, and I answered mail because specificity belongs to the moment you choose, not the moment you're provoked. He scoffed. "From the bank," and I said, "Yes," and the room tightened, the air changing because authority had entered the house even before the letter was read. I waited until afternoon until the house had the hollow quiet of workdays, and then I opened it with a clean cut, careful not to tear anything that would later be read aloud. The words inside measured and procedural, outlining a review, noting an inconsistency, requesting clarification within a stated window. It wasn't an accusation which mattered, it was an invitation to explain, and invitations terrify people who've relied on smiles. The witness confirmation came without theatrics as promised, when the store supervisor emailed a short statement attached as a PDF date, time counter location acknowledgement of presence. Nothing identifying, nothing emotional. Just a sentence that aligned with the camera and the receipt and the approvals, the seventh piece clicking into place without noise. I printed it once and slid it behind the bank letter, not stapling because sequence matters, and I wanted the authority voice to speak first. Daniel paced while I read his phone buzzing and silenced in a rhythm I recognize now as defense, and he said, "This is overkill." The needle line dulled by repetition, and I replied, "It's a window, which is what banks call deadlines," and he frowned because he couldn't argue with the word. Elaine called as if on cue, her voice warm and urgent. "We need to meet," and I answered. "We will not committing to where or when, because the where would decide who behaved." I chose the coffee shop across from the branch glass walls. Afternoon light, a place where people lower their voices instinctively because sound travels. And I placed the letters between us on the small table. When they arrived, the bank notice on top, the witness confirmation visible beneath like a promise you don't have to explain. Elaine laughed once, brittle. "You're making a mountain," and I slid the notice toward her without comment, letting the header do its work. Daniel read faster than he pretended, to jaw tightening as the phrases registered review clarification window, and he said, "This is harassment again." The word now exhausted, and I replied, It's process, because process is how mountains get named. The barista called out an order, a grinder whined, the room moved around us like we were a display, and Elaine leaned in, lowering her voice. "We can fix this," she said, and I answered, "Explain the timeline, because timelines are unforgiving," and I wanted her words on record in a place that remembered them. She waved a hand. "It's all mixed up," and I slid the witness confirmation forward. "This isn't," and the paper looked small on the table, but carried a room with it. The store's neutrality pressed flat into a paragraph. Daniel tried a new angle, softer. "We didn't know," he said, and I replied. "You knew enough to avoid names, and the coffee shop noise seemed to dip the way it does when someone says something precise. The letter sat between us like a third person who refused to be interrupted. Elaine straightened posture stiff. "This is humiliating," she said, and I answered, "It's documented," and she recoiled from the word as if it were a verdict. Daniel asked, "What happens if we don't respond?" And I said, "The window closes," which was true and terrifying enough to redirect him toward cooperation. We spoke in outlines, then, not stories, dates, times, places, and every time their answers drifted, the papers pulled them back. The witness confirmation anchoring the conversation to a public room neither of them controlled. The coffee went cold, the light shifted and people came and went, and I let the scene run because endurance exposes inconsistencies faster than pressure. When Elaine finally said, "I didn't authorize her," and Daniel said, "Who?" in the same breath, the dissonance hung there, and I didn't resolve it for them, because resolution belongs to the authority that wrote the letter. I gathered the papers and stood, not triumphant, just finished, and said, "Respond by Friday," a sentence lifted directly from the notice, because quoting authority removes you from the argument. Outside, Daniel caught my arm and hissed, "You're cornering us." And I answered no and held up the envelope. "They are." And he let go, understanding too late that the corner had walls now. Back home, I scanned the witness confirmation into the folder and labeled it with the same short code, keeping the chain intact, and I forwarded the bank notice to Mark with a single line, "Witness attached," and he replied within minutes received, because lawyers respect brevity. That evening, Elaine left a voicemail that started angry and ended careful a pivot I archived without comment, the ladder of escalation filling neatly. Daniel slept on the couch, the house quiet except for the hum of appliances and the sense that options were narrowing, when authority writes denial loses its favorite hiding places. On Friday morning, the response window half spent, Daniel handed me a draft explanation he'd typed vague enough to feel safe, and I read it without reacting, then slid it back. "Add dates," I said, and he swallowed, because dates are where stories crack. I didn't send anything yet. I waited until the afternoon, until the bank's clock approached close of business, because timing reminds people who sets it, and when I finally forwarded the response, I attached the witness confirmation again, not as threat, but as context, because context prevents relitigation. The reply from the bank was automated and polite, acknowledging receipt, promising review, and that promise felt heavier than any argument we'd had because it moved the story out of our hands. I placed the letters back in the folder and put the folder in the drawer with the envelope still sealed, understanding that the cornering move isn't loud. It's when exits quietly disappear and everyone notices at the same time. I turned off my phone, knowing the next message would arrive with a badge attached. The branch lobby smelled like paper and sanitizer, the kind of neutral that makes voices behave, and the fraud supervisor badge caught the light the moment its owner stepped through the glass doors. Metal flashing once before settling against a navy jacket. Like a punctuation mark, the object doing its work without permission. Tina stood off to the side near the brochure rack, posture open but present, and the branch manager waited by the desk with hands folded, already aware that today wasn't about pleasantries. The supervisor introduced himself by first name and title, only, no flourish, and Daniel's shoulders stiffened as if he'd heard a language he didn't speak fluently. Elaine smiled reflexively, the social smile that assumes proximity equals immunity, and said, "We're family." And the supervisor nodded once. That won't be necessary, choosing precision over warmth. I took a seat across from them. Folder closed envelope still sealed inside because the sequence mattered, and the supervisor placed a thin tablet on the desk, the screen already awake with a timeline that looked boring until you knew what it measured. "We're here to confirm an inconsistency," he said, voice level, and the word confirm settled differently than review, heavier, closer to a decision. He tapped the screen, and the bank's confirmation appeared: date, time, merchant category approval code, clean clipped, undeniable, and the room leaned forward despite itself, because authority invites attention the way a stage light does. When the badge turned toward them, the room stopped treating denial as an option. Elaine laughed once too quickly. "This is all a misunderstanding," and the supervisor replied, "We'll see. Not unkind, just complete." He asked Daniel to confirm his whereabouts at 3:42 p.m., and Daniel answered carefully. Near the office, a hedge that would have passed in private, and the supervisor nodded and swiped, revealing the confirmation of presence tied to the store's Log North Wing Cosmetics timestamped, paired against the approval code, the alignment exact enough to make hedges look like lies. Tina glanced at the clock on the wall and wrote something on her clipboard, the small motion amplifying the formality, and a teller at the far desk pretended not to listen while listening anyway. "This is harassment," Daniel said again, the word now thin, and the supervisor replied, "It's reconciliation, a better word that left less room to wriggle." Elaine leaned forward, lowering her voice. "We can resolve this quietly." And the supervisor met her gaze. Quiet isn't a setting, and the badge flashed again as he shifted the metal, catching the light like a reminder. He asked for the card, and Elaine hesitated just long enough to register, then produced it with a flourish meant to suggest generosity, not obligation, and slid it across the desk. The supervisor didn't take it yet. He let it sit because anticipation disciplines behavior. This account shows repeated approvals, inconsistent with stated presence, he said, reading from the confirmation and use by a non-authorized party, and Elaine's smile fractured at the phrase non-authorized, as if the word had teeth. I opened the folder, then slow enough to be noticed, and placed the witness confirmation and the earlier logs on the desk, without commentary, aligning edges, because order is persuasive, and the supervisor nodded once, acknowledging the chain without asking for it. The confirmation landed like a verdict written before anyone arrived. Daniel tried one last angle. "We didn't know," and the supervisor asked, "Did you know the cardholder?" And Daniel swallowed because the answer carried consequences either way. "Yes," he said, and the supervisor nodded again, tapping the screen. "Then you knew the limits," and the sentence closed a door. Elaine raised her voice. "You're humiliating us," and the branch manager spoke for the first time. "Ma'am, please lower your voice, authority spreading laterally now, not just vertically." The supervisor finally took the card between two fingers and turned it over the embossed name, catching the overhead light, and said, "We're canceling this account. Access effective immediately. Not loud, not dramatic, just timed." And he slid the tablet toward me to confirm the screen, asking for acknowledgement like a receipt does. Daniel stood, chair legs scraping. "You can't do that." And the supervisor looked up. "I can," and gestured to the badge, and "I am," and the scrape echoed longer than it should have, because the room had decided which sound mattered. Elaine reached for the card and stopped herself, hand hovering, then falling back to her lap, and the supervisor tapped the screen, a soft beep replacing the old approval sound with its opposite, a refusal that felt final. Tina's pen moved again, and the teller's fingers paused mid-count, the witnesses absorbing the shift as it happened in real time. I signed where indicated, not smiling, not apologizing, and the tablet chimed once more, confirmation complete, and the supervisor slid the card into a small envelope marked "Cancelled," the word printed, not handwritten because permanence likes ink. Daniel's phone buzzed with a notification, and he looked down despite himself, then up pale. "It's not working," he said, and the supervisor replied, "Correct," and the room exhaled. Elaine tried to recover. "This is outrageous," and the branch manager said, "We'll escort you out," choosing the plural because witnesses prefer clarity. As they stood, the supervisor addressed me. "You'll receive written confirmation," and I nodded. "Thank you, because gratitude belongs to process, not people." Outside, the glass passers-by slowed, curious, and the sunlight made everything flatter, more honest. And as Elaine and Daniel were guided toward the exit, Elaine hissed, "You planned this," and I answered, "I documented it, and the distinction mattered enough to sting." The supervisor removed the badge and slipped it back into his pocket, the metal disappearing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a room rearranged by authority, and Tina gave me a small nod, professional to the end. I gathered my folder and stood the chair light now that the weight had moved, and the branch manager asked if I needed anything else, and I said no because the point had been made. Outside, the air felt sharper, the city louder, and my phone chimed with the official cancellation notice, as promised, the screen confirming what the room had already accepted. When the badge left the building, the truth stayed behind to do its work. The canceled card confirmation screen glowed quietly on my phone at 3:19 p.m., the object small enough to be missed if you weren't looking for it, definitive enough to rearrange lives if you were, and I held it steady while the city moved on around me. Traffic and different pedestrians unaware that a financial artery had just been closed with a tap. Daniel's name appeared beneath the notification, like an afterimage. His message short and stunned. "What did you do?" And I didn't answer, because the screen had already spoken more clearly than any explanation I could give. I sat in the car for a moment longer, letting the adrenaline drain, because payoffs feel anticlimactic when they're procedural, and procedural is the point. The confirmation included a timestamp, clean and exact, and I took a screenshot, not out of paranoia, but habit, the way accountants preserve endings as carefully as beginnings, and I saved it to the folder where the chain now felt complete enough to rest. When I drove home, the house felt larger rooms opening as if they'd been waiting for permission, and Daniel stood in the kitchen with his phone in his hand like a broken compass, his voice unsteady. "It declined," he said, stating the obvious as if it were an accusation. And I replied, "Yes, because sometimes agreement is the sharpest boundary." Elaine called, then her voice raw. How could you and I let it go to voicemail, the message arriving later, as a cascade of outrage and disbelief that ended with a plea for family, the words stretched thin by overuse. I made tea, the kettle's whistle grounding, and I placed the phone face down on the counter, choosing quiet over victory, because justice doesn't need an audience once it's been witnessed. Daniel tried again, closer now. "You embarrassed us," and I answered. "You spent in public returning the cause to its origin," and he recoiled as if the phrase were a mirror he didn't want to look into. The confirmation screen did its work without moving texts, slowed calls, spaced out the frantic energy of entitlement, replaced by the careful pacing of people who realize rules apply to them too. At 5:02 p.m., the bank's email arrived, formal and final, outlining the cancellation and the next steps for account security, language stripped of drama, and I forwarded it to Mark with a single word, "Done," and he replied, "Well executed, a compliment." I accepted, not as praise, but as closure. The confirmation didn't shout, it simply refused to change back. That evening, Daniel packed a bag without asking the zipper loud in the quiet house and said, "I need space." And I replied, "Take it, because space is a consequence, not a punishment." And he paused, surprised by the lack of resistance, then left the door closing with a sound that felt less like loss and more like alignment. Elaine's social orbit reacted, next messages trickling in from cousins and friends who'd heard fragments and wanted reassurance, and I answered politely when I did answer, keeping my words boring enough to discourage gossip, because gossip thrives on emotion and starves on procedure. One message stood out, a former neighbor's quiet note. I saw them at the mall that day, and I archived it without replying, grateful but uninterested in expanding the witness list now that the decision was done. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, the kind of sleep that comes when vigilance retires, and in the morning the house felt orderly, in a way it hadn't before surfaces clear decisions already made. The confirmation screen remained in my photos like a bookmark, and I didn't delete it, because endings deserve to be remembered accurately. Over the next days, the practical aftermath unfolded. Accounts resecured, authorized users reviewed limits, reset the mundane work of restoring boundaries, handled with the same care that had built the case, and each task felt lighter because it moved forward instead of circling. Daniel emailed once, apologetic but vague, and I replied with logistics only, scheduling a time to collect the rest of his things, because clarity now mattered more than reconciliation. Elaine sent a final message that tried to reframe events as misunderstandings, and I didn't correct her because reframing is a private activity, and I wasn't responsible for her version anymore. At the grocery store, my card beeped, approved for milk and bread, the sound ordinary again reclaimed, and I smiled at the smallness of it, how approval had returned to its rightful scale. When the system closed the account, it opened my calendar. Friends asked gentle questions, and I answered honestly without embellishment. It was a financial issue, letting them fill in the rest, because the truth doesn't need decoration to stand. I met Tina for coffee a week later to thank her, and she waved it off policy's policy, she said. And I laughed, relieved to speak with someone who understood the comfort of rules. Mark sent a final checklist, and I checked each item off with satisfaction that felt earned, not vengeful. And I archived the folder at last, moving it from active to resolved, a small ritual that marked the end more clearly than any argument ever could. The canceled card confirmation screen dimmed as my phone went to sleep, and I let it trusting memory now that the record was complete. And when I turned out the lights that night, the house felt honest. No approvals echoing where they didn't belong. No timestamps arguing with reality. Justice didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with silence, and the silence held. I'm standing at the kitchen counter in the present tense again, the afternoon light slanting through the window at the same angle it did. The day everything finally aligned, and the shredded card pieces sit in a small glass bowl like evidence that's finished speaking. Jagged edges catching the light. No numbers intact enough to remember the object, reduced to what it always was, plastic with borrowed power. I don't feel triumphant holding the bowl. I feel precise the way you do after closing a ledger that finally balances, and the quiet in the house isn't tense anymore, it's earned. The motif resolves itself without effort. Now approval never meant consent, and consent doesn't need to be loud to be final. I tip the bowl slightly, and the pieces clink together, a sound that's small but decisive. And I think about how often noise disguised theft and how silence returned ownership. Daniel's absence has settled into routine, his things gone from the closet, his voice no longer shaping the day, and the space he left behind feels neutral rather than hollow, like a room after furniture is rearranged to suit how you actually live. I rinse the bowl and dry it, placing it back in the cabinet where it will hold fruit again, because objects deserve new jobs once their old ones are done. The phone on the counter lights briefly, with a mundane notification calendar reminder, dentist appointment, and I smile at the ordinariness of it, how the extraordinary collapses back into daily life when justice does its work quietly. I drop the last shard into the trash and hear the lid close clean and final. I think back to the store's white retail lights and how they flattened faces into truth, to the receipt whispering out of the printer, at 3:42 p.m. to the CCTV monitor, turning a private wrong into a public fact. And I notice how memory sharpens details that mattered and releases the rest. The exact tone of Elaine's laugh is gone. Daniel's excuses blur, but the timestamps remain crisp anchored because time is an honest witness when you stop interrupting it. Friends ask now gently how I'm doing, and I answer with the truth that fits the present. I'm settled, which surprises them because they expect anger or relief or grief, and settlement sounds boring. But boring is the reward for doing hard things the careful way. At work, numbers behave again, budgets closing cleanly, meetings ending on time, and I realize how much energy leaks when your life runs parallel ledgers you're afraid to compare. I run the dishwasher, the hum steady, and I let my thoughts move without guarding them, because there's nothing left to catch me off balance. The evidence has been archived, the authority exercised, the account closed, and the future feels like a schedule instead of a fight. Elaine hasn't called in weeks. When she did last, her voicemail was cautious, her voice learning new boundaries by feel, and I saved it without listening twice because repetition feeds old dynamics. Daniel emailed once more longer this time, full of apologies that circled responsibility without landing, and I read it once, then replied with a short acknowledgement and logistics, choosing clarity over closure, because closure is a story we tell ourselves, not something other people can deliver on demand. I meet Mark for coffee and thank him again, and he waves it off. "You followed the process," he says, and I nod, understanding now that process isn't cold, it's kind because it gives everyone the same rules and lets outcomes stand without theater. Tina sends a holiday card with a brief note. "Hope you're well," and I place it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a clock, a private joke. I don't need to explain. On a quiet Sunday, I pull out my old journals and notice how the entries change after the cancellation date. Sentences shorter, fewer questions, more plans, and I understand that certainty doesn't mean you know everything. It means you know what you're responsible for and what you're not. I cook dinner for one, without resentment. Music, low chopping vegetables with a rhythm that feels like momentum. And when the pan hisses, it's a friendly sound, not a warning. The house holds my footsteps without echoing them back as doubt. I wash up and stand by the window watching neighbors walk dogs and argue gently about roots, normal life continuing in its ordinary bravery. And I think about how many stories hinge on moments people call small because they don't want to name the courage it takes to hold still long enough for truth to show itself. The bowl that held the card shards is back on the counter with apples, now red skins glossy. A reminder that containers don't define contents, and I bite into one juice crisp approval, restored to its rightful scale. A purchase, a taste, a choice that belongs to me. I open my banking app out of habit and scroll once not to check for threats, but to confirm order, and I close it again without ceremony, trusting the system because the system now matches reality. A text from a friend arrives movie tonight, and I answer yes without hesitation, because the future is light enough to accept invitations again. As I grab my coat, I catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and see a face that looks familiar in a way it didn't for a while, eyes steady, shoulders relaxed, and I think about the difference between seeing yourself erased in a store and seeing yourself returned in a kitchen, both under white light, both public in their own way. Outside, the evening is cool and clear, and as I lock the door, the sound is definitive but not defensive, just a boundary doing its job. I walk to the car and start the engine, the radio coming on mid-song, and I let it play, not changing the station, not needing control over every variable anymore. The road opens ahead, lanes marked signs readable, and I drive without replaying the past because the past has been recorded well enough to stay put. I move forward knowing that approval was never the prize agency was, and agency once reclaimed doesn't need witnesses to remain true.